Welcome to Methods 2, Week 10. This week we are going to start in on rendering with Enscape. Okay, we are going to start by opening Rhino, and when you open it, right here you should see Enscape Rhino plugin. As you open it, you don't have to do anything, but what you want to do is when you open your file, so we're all going to open the Week 10 demo, what you should see up here is a tab for Enscape and a tab for Enscape capturing, and then you'll see under those there's a series of tool buttons, and that's what we're going to be using today. If you do not see these, what you need to do is go into Tools and go into Options, and when you do that, you can see there's a bunch of properties here. One of the options here is Plugins. So under Plugins, you should have Enscape Rhino plugin. Yes, here should be loaded, and then you can go to Toolbars, and if your Enscape isn't loaded under Toolbars, you can click this box here, and it should open it up in your file. So if you're not seeing the toolbars, you need to go into Options, into Toolbars, and make sure you click on Enscape and then hit OK. All right, I'm going to cancel out because mine is already working. Okay, so here's that toolbar if you want a floating toolbar, but I already have this one, so I'm not going to use that. So now we've got our screen. So you can work in the one that you have. If you don't have one, you can use the demo that is online. What we're going to do is we're going to take the screen and we're going to put it into Enscape. So let's just run the program and see what happens. Okay, so if you're opening Enscape, you're going to have a toolbar up here, just like we talked about. It's either going to look like this one, or it's going to look like this one. It's all the same, it's just slightly different logos, same content. So to run Enscape, you're going to hit this orange box with a green arrow, and this is going to launch Enscape in a separate window. Okay, so I'm going to hit this, and it's going to load, as you're seeing here. And what it's doing is it's pulling your file into the program, and now you have Enscape in a separate window. So if you're working on two screens like we are in the computer lab, you want to move Enscape to another screen. In order to do this tutorial, I'm going to have to shrink it so we can look at two things at once, but let's look at what we have here in our basic settings. So if you click on the screen and right-click with the mouse, you can start to rotate around the image. And in this case, you'll see there's already shadows going, there's already sun going, and we'll talk about how we can control all those things. So you can rotate around the object and kind of see it in every view. The other thing you can do is you can change the different types of views. So we've got here, we're working in perspective, and if you look up here, you'll see a little cube, and this is how you control the three kinds of views you have. You have perspective, you have two-point perspective, and you have orthographic. So the way that I like to work is if I'm figuring things out, I like to work in perspective. That's the easiest way to move around Enscape. If I'm shooting a perspective view, I'm going to use two-point. And then if I'm shooting either a plan, elevation, section view, I'm going to use orthographic, or if I'm wanting to shoot an axonometric, I can use orthographic. But the great thing about Enscape is we can also link the views to Rhino. So I'll show you how to save a view and open it into Enscape. But let's just look at what happens with these different views. So let's go into, I'm going to zoom a little bit. If you double click, it'll zoom into a spot in your model. So there I zoomed into the hallway. So let's start right here. So now I'm in perspective view. Watch what happens when I change to two-point. So two-point generally saves your view, but see how now all the verticals are straight up vertical? This is how you want to render out your views always for perspectives. We want those verticals to be two-point verticals, otherwise things start to look a little bit crazy. Okay, and then if we switch to orthographic, let's see what happens. So orthographic, it starts to actually look a little bit distorted. But what you have is you've got an axonometric view of your project. And this is kind of a strange view, but I'll show you how we can actually make two-dimensional views and how we can link things together. So let's look at some of the menus up here in terms of moving things around. So if you go up to the top here and you click on this little wheel, if you click on that, it'll open some of your control settings. If you need to adjust your mouse, I think we really use devices or preferences, but really if you want to adjust the mouse and some of these different elements, you can do that. If you click this little circle with the question mark in it, it will hide and unhide this panel. And then if you click on the settings, this is where we adjust a bunch of the different elements in the model. So we'll go through that a little bit more after we set the materials. This little guy with a headset is actually the VR setting. So this is actually a really good program to do VR in. So if you have an Oculus Quest or a number of different things, you can put the VR headset on and actually walk around your space, which we've done in some of our upper level studios. It's pretty fun to walk around your own designs. Here you can see there's some wings, but they're grayed out, which means you can't select them. If you click here on ortho and you switch to perspective, this allows you to either fly or walk. So if you do walk mode, it's going to pull you down to a ground plane. We don't really have a ground plane in this, but it'll pull you to more of an eye level. And then fly mode allows you to kind of move around like an angel. Those are your main modes there. And then we talked about these setups for different orthographic views. Now, once you're in orthographic and you're clicked on here, you can see up on the right hand side you get a couple different views, standard views. So let's look at what happens when we use those. If we click into the space and then we use, I like to use the number pad. If we do 8, it starts to give us all the flat views of our project. So north, south, east, west. So look, we've got a nice elevation shot there. That's a top view because I can see my screen sticking out from the bottom. And if you were to combine a top view with, say, the clipping planes that we learned earlier, you could start to see that you could have rendered plans. Same with the elevations, you could have rendered sections. So you can kind of adjust these elements, and that can be really handy. Okay. So in terms of moving around views, we've adjusted our view types, and you can see over here we've got our standard views. You can see just beneath it we have some settings to adjust the sun. So let's see what those do. So if you do the letter U or the letter I, and you typically have to click into the screen, and then if I hit U and just kind of hold it down, you can see how it changes the sun or the time of day. So this mimics the sun moving east to west in the sky. If you do the next step underneath, the solar angle, so that's shift plus U or I. So if I hold shift, you can see how it changes that sun angle. So as you move different times in the day, and we'll talk about what the right sun angles are for your project, you can kind of move that sun around using U, I, and shift. That sets the sun in different places. So you can also do a couple of these supplements. So if you're wanting to move, if you hit control, you can move faster. If you're feeling like you're moving too slowly, I'm holding the left key and rotating, and then control allows me to move a little bit faster. If you look up here at the top, you can also use the commands like W, A, S, and D. If you're the kind of person that likes video games, you might be more comfortable with that. You can use the space bar to kind of shift between walk and fly. But again, this look around is your left key, so it kind of rotates it. It rotates the object around you, whereas orbit is the right click. which allows you, if I switch into perspective, orbit works a little bit better. It allows you to kind of shift around. It's not really working for me right now. In space. And then pan is the center bar. And again, if you double click into a spot, it'll move you into that position. Right? So I'm primarily left clicking and then holding the left button down and rotating around. That allows me to look around. And then you can see once you're inside a space, you can move yourself forward and backward, left and right, and then up and down with the keyboard, that WASD-EQ. So if I want my eye level to shift up or down, if I want to slide to the left, slide to the right, forward, backward, I'm using all of these keys to do that. So now that we're inside the space, you can also see how the time of day works. So if I hit U and I, it changes the time of the day. If I hit the shift, you can see the shadows become shallower or deeper, depending on what I'm doing. Okay, so those are your primary moving around buttons. Okay, okay, so the next thing we want to do is let's look at how we can control the way this image looks. So to do that, we're going to move this over a little bit into the screen so you can see what's going on. And then I'm going to go into this eyeball, which is the visual settings menu. So if I go in here, I have a couple of things that I can control. So right now I'm in white mode, which means that there are no materials applied. Everything looks white and neutral. This is an excellent mode to use when you're figuring out massing and figuring out openings, and you don't have to get bogged down with materiality. I use this all the time. It's great to do a model and then you can print it out and sketch on it. So that's white mode. What's nice about white mode is it has what's called outlines. So if you can see here, if I take my outlines all the way down to 0, all of my objects have no edges, right? If I start to turn the outlines on, you can see there's a little bit of a pencil looking outline, and you can scale this up. You can make it super heavy, which I don't think looks great. I usually try to stay, depending on the scale and the level of detail, around 20–25%. But it gives you this nice crisp edge, which can look really nice when you're rendering. So that's outlines. And then you can start to adjust here. You've got your projection perspective, which we've already set. We went through that earlier. There's an auto exposure, which is actually a nice setting, and it allows the images to become a little bit more controlled. You can adjust the exposure button, which just lightens or darkens it, just like a camera. Field of view, this can help. Remember, we did this when we were in interior spaces where we could see a little bit more. It can start to get distorted, but it allows you to see a little bit more space. Depth of field allows you to sort of focus on a thing or not focus on things. So if you see how, if I zoom in, it's going to focus on this, or if I increase the depth of field, it focuses on a certain area and then blurs some of it out. So again, it starts to work a little bit more like a camera. I think we typically keep that all the way down to 0. And then here at the bottom, you've got a series of options for rendering quality. Right now we're at Ultra. It's going to depend on what you want to do with your renderings. If you're just doing some tests, you can do smaller images. We can see the settings that we have this at, and when we get to the Output tab. But that's your quality. If you go to the next tab, this is your image. So you've got highlights, shadows. Here's a big one that I like to use. We've got saturation. Your default is going to be this sort of warm tone. If you're doing a black and white drawing, I suggest you take that saturation all the way down to 0. But if you have it up, you're going to get some of those warm tones, and then you can also start to change your color temperature, which will change the whole screen. See how it's changing that background? So that can warm or cool up your image. I typically leave this around 6,000. I don't like my stuff too warm, and I don't like it too saturated. That's a personal thing. There's some effects in here. We're not really using those right now. There's a number of things in terms of atmosphere, sun brightness. Can start to, this stuff really makes more of a difference when you've got materials applied, which we'll do a little bit later. Shadows and artificial lights, I wouldn't worry about that stuff right now. The sky, for this project, we want you to do this all with a white background, but you can come in, if I unclick that, it starts to give you this background and a horizon, and then you can actually pull in other items. So this one's clear, but then there's a skybox, which sets a horizontal plane, but then there's also some baked in backgrounds, which are kind of fun, but a little bit weird. Right now, everything's black and white because we're in white mode. Here, I'll switch it to, oh, and because I turned the saturation down. There you go. We have the saturation up. So skybox gives you some clouds, desert, construction site, white cubes. Sometimes people use white cubes to make it look like you're in an urban environment. White ground, urban, town. They're a little cheesy, but they can be useful. But like I said, I typically use white background. I'm going to leave it on skybox for right now so I can show you a couple of the other elements under, let's see, where did, there we go. So if we go into desert, maybe this works also with clear. There. If you go into clear, you can start to change the clouds. So you can make more dense clouds. You can have more or less variety of clouds. So if you know your clouds, you can have cirrus, more cirrus clouds. Those are the feathery ones. You can have more here. You can bump up that variety, and then you can bump up your density. Have a more cloudy day versus have a more sunny day. Yada, 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 right? That's the sky. So for this, we're going to stick with a white background. And then the last tab here is output. So we had it set on the main page to an ultra setting. So here's your resolution, and I have this set at a super high custom resolution. If you're having trouble exporting it, it may be because your resolution is really high, but these are really good settings to kind of keep everything at. And once we get a couple of things on here, we'll do some exporting. But right now there's some export options where some things can come with you, or you can just do the basic image. And then I always like to do, we set these at PNGs, which allows us to have a transparent background. And you'll see how that works when we do some exporting. But these are the settings I would leave your visual settings at. So again, we're going to switch this back to white. We've got our outlines at 20%, and then the rest of the stuff is as we set it. And that'll be good for this project right now. Okay, now we are going to talk about creating and exporting views. So to create a view, there's a couple different ways to do it. So let's talk about creating a view in Enscape. So say you want to pick your interior perspective. So let's find that perfect view. Maybe I want to stand here and move myself up. And I feel like that is a pretty good view right there. I see a little bit of the screen. I see some nice shadows. Maybe I want to rotate it a little bit, right? We want to compose these to show what we want to show, right? So a combination of using the orbit and the pan can really get you to where you want to be. But I like this because I see a little bit of the screen here. And then the screen, as it goes away from me, I see the shadow, I see the wall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to the binoculars. And that is our view manager. So if I click on that, I'm going to get this control over here on the side, and I'm going to do create view here at the bottom. I'm going to call this view corridor 1, and then it's going to set all of this stuff for me. So if I hit create, and then let's say I exit out of that, I go do a bunch of other stuff, I fix my model, I do this and that, I go back to my view management, and then I click corridor 1, whoop, goes right back to that view. So that view is locked and set, and I can do whatever I want with that, and that is great. If I want to change it, I can go onto it, and I can get into here, I can rearrange the view, and I can save it. But what's really nice about this is that you can also change your sun position and set it. So we talked about setting this in morning and afternoon views into your building. So here we can set the sun position here for a morning view, and then we can save a copy of that. Then we can make another view that is exactly the same and then change the sun to be the afternoon. So we're going to start here with morning. So here's your building and plan. So this is your sun. See, we can move that sun around. So this is north, south, east, and west. So we know that the sun rises in the east, goes across the middle of the day, the sun's about here, and then it sets in the west. So that's the end of the day. So morning, noon, afternoon. Okay. The other thing we know is that the sun up here is high in the middle of the day, and then it's lower towards the beginning and the end of the day. And this varies depending on the time of year. The sun gets higher in the sky in the summer, and it's a little bit lower in the winter. But regardless, at the beginning and the end of the day, it's a little bit low. So if we're going to do east and west, we're probably pretty good having the sun relatively low for both of them. And then over here, we can pull this over here to the morning. And it doesn't have to be like super early in the morning, but you can adjust this a little bit as it goes up until we get kind of cool shadows a little bit. Right? So maybe that's my morning view. A little bit low, a bit over. I can do save right here. All right, that's perfect. On this view, I can do create view again. And I'll create a new view, and I can call that corridor 2. And then I can take that same sun, I can move it over to here. And that can be my afternoon sun. I can save it, create, and then I can exit. And now watch what happens. Again, I go over here, I go do a bunch of stuff. I go to my view management. Here's corridor 1, that looks good. Here's corridor 2, that looks good. Morning, afternoon, morning, afternoon. Right? So that's what you have to do for your 3 views. You need to set the view that you want, and then you need to name it, do a morning view, and do an afternoon view. Okay? So let's do this a different way. Let's create a view in Rhino and then bring it into, see how we can bring it into Enscape. Okay, so if I want to create a view that comes from Rhino, I need to go back to Rhino, and I'm just going to, in this case, I'm going to minimize my window so I can go back to my Rhino model. Even though Enscape will still be open, if I want to get back to Enscape, I can just click on my, hover over my Rhino tab, and you can see here's my Enscape window still there. There's my Rhino window, right? Because they're still running together when I'm working. So one of the views you have to do is an isometric, axonometric view that shows this side. So let's go to the views the way we normally make them in Rhino. So let's do set view. Let's go to isometric. So I know this is the south side, so it's going to be a south view. So I can maybe do southeast or southwest. Let's see which one I like more. Let's do that one. So that's southeast. So that's a nice orthographic view. That's what I want to render. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go into Rhino and I'm going to save this view here. So if I go to my little tab in Rhino and I go to set view, and then I go down here, instead of picking one of these, I go to named views. And when I go to named views, I get this window to come up. And if I just click the save button, it'll save the view that I'm currently in. And I'm going to call it Axon 1. And I'm just going to hit OK. So that view is saved. So I did that in Rhino. If I go back to my Enscape, I look at my views, look at that, Enscape made that view for me. Problem with that view is right now I'm in the wrong. So I click on Axon and it comes in, but it looks wrong. Why does it look wrong? It's because it's in perspective. So what I need to do before I look at that view, I need to go into my orthographic. Then if I click on Axon, then it comes in correctly. So you need to know what kind of view you're in. So now that we've got Axon, let's hold that there, and then let's edit it. And then if you don't have if the sun is not on, because we made this view in Enscape, you just have to toggle that button on, and now we get our sun. So right now we've got our afternoon sun, and we've got our morning sun. Okay, afternoon, morning. So you can go through that same process. So let's save the morning view. And then we can create a new view. If we stay right here, we can call this Axon 2. We can move the sun to the other side, and we can create an afternoon view. Right, so now we've got these two views. So we have to see how the sun changes the animation of it. So again, when you go into these views, you have to make sure they're in the view that you started with. Make sure you have the right view selected. Okay. So before I go into Axon 2, if I go to orthographic, then I click Axon 2, I get the view that I want. Before I go into corridor 1, I switch over to perspective, corridor 1. There we go. So that looks good. Okay, so now we have our view set, and we can take all of these views if we want to work in white mode. But now let's have a little bit of fun and let's move into a different mode. So we're going to go to the eyeball, and we're going to start putting some materials onto this file. So I'm going to change my mode here from white to none. So none, by default, all these materials are just the same white material. So right now, nothing has a material on it, but as we add our materials to it, we will start to get them in here. So let's talk about how we add materials, and that goes back into Rhino. So let's go back to Rhino, and this goes back to layers. So all the stuff we've talked about all semester about having layers and using your layers wisely, this is where it becomes super useful. So we use it a bunch for line weights, but now let's talk about how we do it for materials. So in this demo file, I have 3 materials, and I'm just going to render the screen. I'm going to leave the corridor white. So let's look at the different materials for the screen. So we've got a vertical frame, so that's my black pieces. We have horizontal frame, that's the blue pieces, and then we have the pink pieces are my infill. So how do we add materials? So materials are a 2-step process. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go into the material over here. So you need to open your layers and make sure you can see the material tab if you can't. It's right next to the colors. Just open it up. Like if it just looks like this and you can't read it, just make it a little bit wider so you can read what it is. So here, if we click on the material, the default material is what is on everything right now. And what we want to do is we want to make a new material. So here we're going to click Use a New Material. And what we want to do here is we want to make it an Enscape material. This is important stuff. So make the material Enscape and then give it a name. I'm going to call it vertical. I'll call it frame vertical. So it matches my layer. So then I hit OK. And you can see here, my material is frame vertical. So I'm going to do the same thing with the horizontal and the same with the infill. So again, default material, use a new material, an Enscape material, give it a name, frame horizontal. Okay, so now I have 3 materials over here. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to go into Enscape and I'm going to look for the button that's about material. So in this version, it's a checkerboard with a, I don't know, an eyeball on it. And in this version, it's a sphere with a checkerboard on it. So just look for a checkerboard. It's going to take you to the same place. And right here, you've got now these 3 materials that you just made show up over here. And what you can do is you can click on a material and let's just see what happens if we want to make it a color. So I'm going to make my horizontal elements. Let's make them brown. Let's pick a brown. That's a bad brown. Let's pick a brown that looks decent. So you can use the standard colors. You can go into advanced, pick something that looks a little more sienna-y, maybe with a little more gray. I like that color. And that is brown. And then we don't worry about the rest of these things right now. And then let's pick the vertical. Let's do the same thing. We'll pick a color. Let's say the vertical is we'll call vertical super white. Let's do pink so it shows up. And then the infill, let's do something that is a nice light blue. This will be a little, I don't know, I don't think I can do that pink. Let's do a different color. Let's do a light blue and a darker blue. So we've got blue and wood. That's kind of a nice combination. And then let's just close that window. And then we're going to go into Enscape and see what happens. Okay, so we're going to open up Enscape. And now my model looks like that. Now, if your model still looks black and white, what you want to do is you want to go back into Rhino, and this button will refresh your file. So if it still looks black and white, hit this button, and everything should come out in color. And if it's not in color, do make sure that you went to that eyeball and you changed the mode from none. And then here you need to make sure you have your saturation. If it looks like this, your saturation is 0. You want to move your saturation up. Okay. So now we've got, you can start to see, depending on where you are, some of these images look good. The more you saturate, the brighter it starts to become. Those horizontals are probably a little too bright. You also can start to see how those outlines play into the rendering. So you can just kind of adjust these things to get it looking the way you want it to look. So that's just with basic colors. So if I decide I don't like something, I can go back to the materials in Rhino and I can adjust them. So that frame looks way too dark. I'm going to come in and actually make it a light gray. That blue looks fine, the infill looks fine. So there we go. We've got sort of a nice setup. Let's see what happens. Make sure you close it so it processes. Go back here and look. Oh, that looks much better. Those horizontals don't look nearly as nuts. And then if I go into my corridor, I'm still in orthographic mode. I go into my corridor in perspective. I start to get some nice colors on here. And now if you look and see what happens in your views, let me make this full screen. Look at that. Corridor 1, corridor 2. See how the colors change as the time of day changes? So once you get the colors the way you want them, they're going to change a little bit. Let's look at the axon. Remember to change it to orthographic first. See how the colors change depending on the time of day? Pretty great. Again. All right, so those are just basic colors. Let's look at what other things we can do with materials. So again, we can go back here to our materials. What we can do is if we open our materials window again, and if you go to these three lines to the right of materials, you can do import from Enscape material library. So this is where things get fun. If you go to materials library, so you don't want to import all of them at once, but you can think, well, what do I want to have in my view? So let's say I want those verticals to actually be wood. So I can come in here and I can try to find a wood that I think will look good. And I can import it. So I'm just going to pick sort of a, maybe like, I want so my verticals are running vertically. So I want my grain to run vertically. So I'm going to pick one of these with a vertical grain. Maybe we'll pick a wilder grain. So if I just hit import, then I can bring that into the project, hit close, and now I have a wood in here. So I have a wood in here that I could apply to things, or I could come up here to my vertical frame pieces. I click on these three dots, and I can do replace with Enscape material. So I know I like that wood 42. So then I can go in here, go back to wood 42. If I really like a material, I can click on that star and it'll show up in my favorites. It can be handy if you find some materials you like. So we've got that wood 42. And then once you have a wood material in here, see how it has a texture? So the albedo is the material quality, the texture is smooth, and then the roughness usually, depending on what you're doing, has different levels of roughness. And then there's different elements of transparency, but that doesn't really apply to something that is wooden. So let's look and see what happens with that wood infill. So we got to close that material and then go back to our Enscape. And there we go. And I know I said that that was going to be vertical and it's actually horizontal, but you can see the wood was applied to those elements. So since it's horizontal, that just means we need to rotate it back in Rhino. So let's go back into Rhino. There's a little bit of this back and forth, but you'll get used to it. So we go to frame vertical, and then we can actually edit this because it's only applying to this image. So if I click on this texture here, it gives me some options, and one of them is rotation. So I can go in here and just rotate this 90 degrees. I think that will work. Then I go back and then I close it, and then let's see what happens in Enscape, and look at that. Now it's going vertically. It's a little bit big, I'm not really seeing the grain anymore, which means maybe we need to change the scale a little bit. So let's just go back one more time to Rhino, again to here, again to here, and here. So we rotated it, but now we want to change the scale of it. So it's big. Let's see what happens if we make it a quarter of what it is right now. I bet that will look pretty good. There's a little bit of trial and error, but what's nice about this program is that you get your answers pretty quickly. There we go. Look, that looks so much better. It's still a little bit big. Let's scale it down one more time so it looks a little more realistic. Go back to Rhino, material, wood, and then let's just make this 0.1. That looks much better. So now I have wood pattern along my screen. I can see the shadows cast on it, and if I want to rotate around and see what that looks like on the outside, you can see it on the outside. There's some advanced mapping that we could do to make the wood actually wrap correctly, but we're not going to worry about that for class today. But if you zoom in, you can see you've got this nice texture. So that looks good. Okay, so now we've got wood down. So you can do that with lots of different materials in Rhino. But let's say we want these infill pieces to be a little bit more transparent. How do we do that? Okay, so we're going to look at how to make this infill material a transparent material. So let's go back to Rhino. And we open the materials window again. And here we can go to infill. If we click on it, we have a number of things in here. And if you go all the way down to the bottom, you can see there's transparency. So if I scroll that here, the default is that it's cut out. But if I switch it to transmittance, then a whole other bevy of options show up, one of them being opacity and tint color. So let's just see what happens when we leave our opacity at 50%, because we know glass is partially opaque, but we don't want it to be fully opaque, then we just don't see it at all. Okay, so let's close that, and then let's go back to the Enscape window. Look at that. Now our material is partially transparent. So the key about transparent materials is when you've got nothing in the background, it's got nothing to reflect on. But here we have a nice, clear, transparent material. So let's look at what else we can do with that. So we can go back to the material. We can make it more frosted, which will give it a little bit of surface material. So let's see what that does. So there it looks frosted rather than just clear. So you start to see it a little bit more from the inside. Right? But the other thing is we could actually add a texture to it. So there are a number of glass options. So if I go back in here, instead of continuing to adjust this, I could also replace it with an Enscape material. And you can go into glass. So if you just want a clear or somewhat transparent material without a texture on it, just use the material color and change the transparency. But if you wanted to have some kind of texture, the glass by default in Enscape is all textured. So there's a couple of different cool options. Let's pick something that's, this one's got bumps on it. So let's just do replace. And you can change the color. You can tint it a little bit. So let's make it blue again and see what that looks like. So go back to Enscape. And it's not showing up. So I'm going to refresh it. And so what we can see is that we've got the material here, but it's not really showing the transparency that we want. So we can go back to Enscape, go back to that material, and then let's go all the way to the bottom. So here our transparency again is set at cutout. Let's set it to transmittance. And here we have an opacity. And let's just see, let's just adjust these couple things, see what that does. Now we have a nice textured glass in here. So now these are showing without really any thickness because I built them as surfaces. But if I came in back into my Rhino and I started to give any of these thickness, so if I took that solid and I extruded that surface, just like 1/4 of an inch, then when I go back here, it's going to start to read with a little bit more thickness. Let me refresh that to make sure I got that model change. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 in. 1, 2, 3, 4 in. And you can see there it's got a little bit more thickness and a little bit more of an edge to it as compared to these surfaces. But now I've got a nice material. It's got some color. It's got some materiality. So there's a lot you can do with this to add different elements. So let's look at just a couple of other things in terms of materials. So you would do the same thing with the horizontal infill. For now, we're just going to leave that. If you wanted to, for this assignment, you don't need to do anything for these spaces, but I'll show you just a couple of little fun things. So say you wanted, I think grass is fun. So say you wanted to make some grass out here in space. So there's maybe something to see outside the windows. I would make a new layer. So now you can see why layers are important. I would call it grass. And then I would go in here. And I would actually create a new material. Again, Enscape. And I'm just going to call it grass. I'm going to make it green like grass. Here. And then let's go into our materials and let's click on grass. And then you can see here, grass is actually a type. If I click grass, it's got a bunch of options here. So you can make it kind of tall. You can give it some variation. You can give it a color. So let's give it a green, kind of a muted green color. That seems like it'll look nice. And then let's just see what happens with that. Now we have all this nice grass outside our view. And if we go back to our corridor view, I'm going to go to perspective, corridor. Now look, we've got some space outside. Our panels are probably a little too transparent because we can't really see the variation on that, but we can always change that. So our infills may be a little too transparent. Say we make it 57%. Seems reasonable. Now we've got this transparency. Okay? So you can play with a bunch of these different elements. In this case also, now that we have grass, maybe we want to come in and change our view so we have a sky. So we could come in here and we talked about sky. Right now our source is clear. We change it to clear but without the white background. Then we can change the sky. So now you can really start to see what's going on. If you're going to do that, you get this kind of crazy horizon, in which case what you might want to do is take this grass and make it really big so it kind of goes the big distance. So basically I want you all to explore what you can do with this program. So I'm going to make grass go for a long time, and I'm going to move it so it's just below the slab. Be a little further below that slab. And now we've got grass, sky. Again, you don't have to use the sky, but if you wanted to, you can. Or you can adjust your exposure. Again, I like those outlines on, but you can adjust your clouds. You could have no clouds. You just have blue skies. There's your contrails. Okay, so you've got some nice views in here. You don't need to do anything in the corridor, but again, if you wanted to explore some of those materials, say you looked at the slab, here's one thing you can do is instead of doing the 2 steps here, you could come into your materials and you could find a couple of materials you want to use on the project. So say we want to make that slab underneath concrete. Maybe the whole box wants to be concrete. Let's import concrete. Now we've got concrete here, and on, let's say, oops, say all 4 of these want to be concrete. We can click on that, and now we can choose concrete. So then let's just look at what that concrete looks like. Looks good to me. And we can go in here to our view. It's not showing up yet. Let's just refresh. And then this is what's nice about having these corridor views. It's maybe a little dark. So maybe concrete everywhere wasn't the best idea. But again, you can always go back and adjust. And you can tint it lighter. Some materials are just too dark, right? So you can always come in and change that to a different material. Say maybe use one of these lighter concretes to replace. Let's see, there we go. That looks better, although that looks crazy in its whole own right. That texture is way too strong, so we go back and we could change that texture by changing the scale, just like we did. So that's 1.5. Maybe we want to change that to 0.25. That looks a little bit better, but maybe that's just not the best material. Or maybe we only use it on the floor and you change the other layers to maybe the walls and the ceiling. We switch to just that default material. Again, if it doesn't show up, just refresh it. That feels a lot better to me. So play with it, look at your different materials. Your infills can be solid, they can be transparent. There's a lot of stuff to use out there, so get comfortable with it. One last thing I want to show you is adding a scale figure. Okay, once we have a view that we like, what we want to do is we want to export the image. So let's go back to our settings. So let's go to our eyeball. And if you remember, on our output tab, it had a bunch of settings. And then on our main tab, we had rendering quality options. So I'm just going to, for demonstration purposes, move this down to, just go to high instead of ultra. And then our output, I'm just going to do full HD, which is a little bit smaller. And then here you can see I have this box checked, and what it's going to do is it's going to export a view that looks like this, and then a couple other views that we will use at a later date so you can see what those are. But the other thing is it's going to tell you where it's exporting your files to. So I have mine set to export to the desktop. Okay, so once I have all of those set, and I understand where my files are going, I go up here to the top to screenshot, which is also Shift F11. And if I click that, it's going to export my image. And it's going to export it at a higher quality than what we see on the screen. And it's going to put them all on my desktop. So let's see what happened. Here's my Rhino. Here's my desktop. And then I can see I've got a bunch of images here on my desktop. And let's just click through these so we can see what has happened. All right, so this is my first view. This is my rendered view. That looks awesome. Happy with that. This is my alpha channel view. So you can see if you compare it to the image, it's highlighting the open sky. So you could come into this view when we learn Photoshop, which will be next time. You can use this to create skies. There's another one that shows you the transparency of that infill piece. And then this one is a material ID, so it allows you to, again, in Photoshop, select different materials for you to use. Here it allows you to more easily select different parts. This is all about post-processing. And those are your 4 images that come with your view. So this is the image this first image is the one that we are looking for. So once you get this and you're happy with it, this is what you will turn in with your assignment online. Okay, so you're going to do a morning shot, an afternoon shot, so you can just keep going through each of these in Enscape and continue to export screenshots. So again, export screenshot, same thing will happen. It'll put the screenshot in the same place. Here's another set of them. It goes actually pretty quickly if your computer's fast enough. So if you're working down here on the computer lab, so here's another view. And then same thing with all of the other ones.